One symptom of this federalism that you also mentioned is it kind of exasperates this urban-rural divide in our politics, and this is, I mean, a big problem for the left and what we're trying to do politically is this urban-rural divide. So, I mean, what are some things the left can do to start bridging this divide? And are there any recent examples of whether a candidate or an organization or a movement kind of successfully bridging that urban-rural divide?
Sure. Another great question that's very relevant and a difficult one to deal with. So yeah, let's kind of take a step back for a minute and kind of identify exactly what the roots of this are and why it's such a kind of a difficult problem to deal with. So here in the U.S., we have what are known as winner-take-all single-member districts. And if you look at the U.S. and you look at similar countries or countries where they have this kind of similar system of electoral representation, what winds up happening is that they tend to bias parties of the left or even the center left by making it relatively more difficult for them to translate votes into seats in a legislature. Okay, why does that happen? This political scientist named Jonathan Rodden, he does a great job of laying all this out, of explaining why this is the case in a book that he published a couple of years ago called Why Cities Lose. And, to make a long story short, this happens because left-wing voters in the US and in other countries tend to be more geographically concentrated. They tend to be concentrated in more highly urbanized, kind of more densely populated areas for a whole host of reasons that, we can get to here if we want to. But in general, progressive, left-wing, socialist, whatever voters tend to be more geographically concentrated, while conservative voters tend to be more evenly distributed in space. So the system of representation that we have in this country and in countries where they've got a similar kind of system, already tends to be biased against the left and in favor of the right. And then, of course, the Republicans come along, conservatives come along, and then, layer gerrymandering and all the other stuff that they do on top of that, which then makes an already difficult situation even worse. And they do that through various strategies. Viewers may have heard of some of these, like cracking and packing. For example, cracking happens when map makers, the people who come up with these maps for representational purposes, take an area, a concentrated area of, say, progressive or left-wing, or in the U.S., Democratic voters, and kind of do their best to split those people up into a bunch of different districts in order to dilute their vote. One of the best examples of this, I think, in the U.S. is Austin, Texas. Democrats dominate presidential elections in Austin and in the county that contains Austin, but that area is divided up into 6 different House districts, and the Democrats are a minority in 5 of them. So this area, which is a heavily Democratic area, Democratic presidential candidates run away with elections in this area, it only winds up sending 1 Democrat to Congress. And that's, whatever you think of the Democratic Party, I think we probably should agree that is a violation of, just some basic democratic, principles. Then we talk about packing. Packing entails cramming as many of the opposing party's voters as possible into a single district or as few districts as possible. So what winds up happening then is this results in a huge number of, you can call them wasted votes for victorious candidates in heavily, particularly in heavily Democratic areas. So what this all tends to do is that it makes the Democrats' structural challenges arising from their geographical concentration even worse than it already is. And it just tends to reinforce, these pre-existing tensions or divides between kind of more urban areas and more rural areas. And when partisanship tends to kind of overlap or get grafted onto that kind of basic urban-rural split or divide or tension, it's not good. And it tends to polarize politics along the lines that we've seen in this country over the last couple of decades, at least. And unfortunately, that makes it very, very difficult to try to bridge that kind of urban-rural divide because of how the incentives that parties, that candidates face, say, when they're running for office and they have to figure out who to appeal to. It's very difficult, for example, for somebody like an AOC who represents, an extremely urbanized area in the Bronx and Queens to try to make appeals, for example, to kind of more rural, small town or ex-urban voters, because they're not in her district. And she's got to appeal to, the people that live in her own district, which is very urbanized. That kind of dynamic plays out over and over again across, say, the Democratic Party, which then just tends to reinforce these sorts of divides or tensions that already exist. Is there any example of someone that has been able to do this? Not too many recently. One particular example that you can think of is somebody like a Bernie Sanders. Bernie is from a very rural state. The biggest city in Vermont is Burlington, which is, quite small in terms of population. But when he ran for president, for example, he was most popular precisely in these sorts of, more urban or metropolitan areas where you've got, large numbers of younger, working people in particular. How has he been able to do this? I think that's a complicated question. I think one of the reasons why he was able to appeal very broadly and, win election to the House of Representatives in a place like Vermont is precisely because it's so small and Vermont only has, one House seat. The whole state is a district. And so in that sense, it's kind of an exception that sort of proves the rule here about, the size of districts and what have you. So this is a really challenging problem. I don't have any particularly good ideas as to how to try to bridge it or deal with it. I think it's something that's going to require a lot of organizing, a lot of strategizing, and a lot of trial and error over time, because it's a problem that's already baked into the structure of representation and then made worse by all the various stratagems that the Republican Party uses to try to lock in and increase even more that advantage that's already baked in for them.
So, Chris, I think this is going to be our last question for you, but I just want to follow up on what you were saying about some of these structural constraints, right? So, when we're thinking about like what the left should do to try to safeguard or even expand democracy and voting rights in the US, I think that we often come up on this kind of like snowball effect problem where, as you pointed out earlier, like we can't, or, it's like the Democrats can't get a voting bill across the finish line because of the Senate, which is in and of itself a kind of unrepresentative, undemocratic institution. You've talked in your Catalyst essay about work by Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page. They, of course, famously did some research that found that the top 10% of income earners in the U.S. have undue influence on the political system, and because of that, what do? They vote for laws, or they support laws that like re-entrench their power and, roll back rights for everybody else. So again, it's kind of, it almost seems like an insurmountable problem at times. So I'm wondering if you can kind of end by maybe talking a little bit about where you think the left can go. I know that in your essays, you have often talked about the role of the labor movement in trying to expand democracy.
Sure. Tough question. The $1 million question.
Right.
There are tons of like chicken and egg sorts of problems here, right? Of the sort that you just alluded to. And that all makes it extremely difficult to try to find a way out of this sort of impasse. It's a real impasse. And, I don't think in all of the reams of, books and research and articles that I've read about this and, the thinking that I've done about this, it's like, no one's got a really good way out. Precisely because, the constitutional order that we have is like this sort of self-regulating machine that is like by design, kind of extremely difficult to alter or change in any kind of fundamental way. That doesn't mean, though, that the situation is hopeless or there's nothing that people could do to try to move the country to a place where some more fundamental changes and a greater degree of democracy in American politics may become possible. This may not be the most satisfying answer, but the sort of strategy or path that I can conceive of to try to get towards that goal is kind of twofold. One is just continuing to build the power of the left, of the labor movement, of various social movements, as widely and as broadly as we possibly can, to keep building our movement in the places where we've already been able to establish something of a foothold, say like here in New York City, where I live, and in Brooklyn in particular, but also trying to build out our presence more widely, picking a few states and areas within states that are I think particularly important in national politics, and where the local political and social context might be favorable on one level to some degree of left-wing organizing. I think that we would probably find some of those places in states like, kind of northern Rust Belt states, places like Michigan, places like Wisconsin, what have you. And then I think you might also find those places in, southern states. I'm thinking places like Kentucky, where there are some, important, say, logistics clusters where some very important labor organizing can be done, where there are some larger towns and smaller cities where an organized left might be able to establish or keep building a foothold, like say in Louisville, and to keep growing the left in places where we're already weak, so that potentially we can build power at the state level, and maybe even send some people to Congress who can provide additional votes for some of these bills that make some headway, but can't get over the final hurdle. In addition to that, I think if we're ever going to see, some kind of movement towards some sort of new, settlement, or some sort of new reconfiguration of the party system or the system of representation in this country, I think it's likely that results from some sort of crisis, and particularly some sort of crisis that comes out of a conflict-ridden presidential election. American politics today turns on the presidency, both during the campaign period and then, during the period of any administration. It's the fulcrum, and I think that's the thing around which American politics is structured. And our system for electing presidents in this country is just so absurd and archaic that we're lucky in a sense that it doesn't produce more situations like say the year 2000 than it does. One of the more remarkable things about it is that it hasn't produced more of these sorts of situations. Although over the last 20 years, we've had George W. Bush and Trump be elected through the Electoral College while losing the popular vote. I think we'll probably continue to see things like that happen. And if, for example, the Democrats can start winning states like Texas on a regular basis, and the Republicans can't regularly take northern Rust Belt states out of the Democrats' column, this then changes the potential calculations the parties make. Maybe it gives the parties incentives to try to change the system that they don't have now. Maybe if there's an election where one of the candidates can't rack up an electoral college majority, which would then throw the election to the House of Representatives, something that hasn't happened since 1824, people look at that and they say, this whole system is crazy. Maybe we need to change it. So I think that people are going to have to keep organizing and fighting to build power where we don't currently have it, so that we can appeal to a broader audience. And then I think that we have to keep an eye out for various contingencies and unexpected developments, particularly as they come in the arena of presidential politics and campaigns, that might result in some crises and openings that don't currently exist, and, can provide openings for, both a popular movement to demand these changes and also to, alter the calculations and incentives that, political elites have. In any case, it's hard to see how the current system or structure we have is particularly sustainable. It seems like this setup is, on something of a crash course. I don't know how long this can all kind of continue without resulting in some sort of serious crisis. And what happened on January 6th, I hope it's not a foretaste of things to come. But yeah, I think that was a pretty shocking event. It both reveals the extent to which the right wing in this country has become just very contemptuous of even the minimal and limited forms of democracy we have in this country. And I also think it's heightened and highlighted the importance of this kind of democratic agenda and these sorts of basic democratic questions for the left. I think for a long time this has gone kind of under, we haven't paid enough attention to it. It's kind of gone under the radar for us. We've tended to pay attention to, questions of inequality and distribution and what have you, which are certainly central to our politics and to our agenda. But I think these questions of democracy, of our political system, of the basic nature of the regime that we live in and operate in and have to work in are really important. They're becoming increasingly more important. And I think that they're going to be the fulcrum increasingly around which a lot of American politics revolves.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.